Hello and welcome back. Before we begin tonight, I want to tell you something important. Tonight's journey is different from our usual ones. Most of the time when we travel together into the ancient past, we are walking well-lit corridors of history. We have the archaeology. We have the records. We have enough evidence to say with reasonable confidence, this is how these people lived. This is what they ate. This is what their homes looked like. Tonight, we are doing something a little different. Tonight, we are going to a world that exists on the boundary between history and myth. The Bronze Age Greek world, the world that gave us the Iliad and the Odyssey, the world of Achilles and Odysseus and the great ships drawn up on the beach before the walls of Troy, is one of the most tantalizing and elusive periods in all of human history. We know it existed. The archaeology tells us that. The ruins of Mycenae stand in Greece today. Great walls built from stones so enormous that later Greeks assumed they must have been constructed by giants. The ruins of a city at Hisarlik in modern Turkey, which many scholars believe to be Troy itself, show layer upon layer of occupation and destruction stretching back thousands of years. Fragments of clay tablets written in a script called Linear B, the earliest known form of written Greek, give us glimpses of palace economies, of inventories, of names. But the written record of daily life is almost entirely absent. The great epic poems of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were composed centuries after the events they describe, passed down through generations of oral tradition before being written down. They are magnificent. They are among the greatest literary works in human history. But they are not a documentary. They are a memory, filtered through centuries of telling and retelling, shaped by the needs of storytelling as much as by the requirements of historical accuracy. So what you are about to hear tonight is our best understanding, a careful, considered reconstruction built from what archaeology has uncovered, from what Homer preserves, from what we know of Bronze Age material culture and seafaring and the rhythms of ancient Mediterranean life. Where we are speculating, I will tell you so. Where we are drawing on Homer, I will tell you so. Where the archaeology speaks clearly, I will tell you that too. Think of it as an informed dream, a journey into a world that was real, deeply, humanly, complexly real, but which left behind only the faintest of footprints for us to follow. So, make yourself comfortable, let the day go, let your breathing slow, and let me take you to the wine-dark sea, the Bronze Age. The very name has a quality of myth about it, of something half-remembered, half-dreamed, and yet it was as real as anything that has ever existed. Real men and women lived and worked and loved and died in it. Real ships sailed real seas. Real cities burned. The period we are visiting tonight falls roughly in the late Bronze Age, somewhere around the 12th or 13th century before the Common Era. This is the world that archaeologists call Mycenaean Greece, after the great palace city of Mycenae in the northeastern Peloponnese, whose ruins still stand and still astonish. Mycenaean Greece was not one unified nation in the way we might imagine it. It was a collection of powerful palace kingdoms, each centered on a great fortified palace complex that controlled the surrounding agricultural land and coastline. Mycenae itself, Tiryns with its extraordinary walls, Pylos, the palace of the legendary King Nestor, whose Linear B tablets have given us some of our richest glimpses of Bronze Age administrative life, Athens, already ancient, and others, a constellation of kingdoms linked by trade, by marriage alliance, by shared religion, and by the sea. The sea was everything. The Aegean is not a frightening ocean in the way that the North Atlantic is frightening. It is a different kind of sea, dotted with islands, its coastlines always visible, its sailing season long and relatively predictable. A skilled Bronze Age sailor could navigate it by watching the stars at night and the coastline by day, reading the winds, moving from island to island in a chain of short voyages that felt almost like walking. The ships that crossed this sea were remarkable for their time. We know them primarily from representations, paintings on pottery, carvings, frescoes. The Bronze Age Greek warship, which Homer calls a long ship or a black ship, was a sleek, oar-powered vessel built for speed rather than cargo. It was open, no deck covering the rowers, no cabin for the crew. It sat low in the water. It was fast and maneuverable, capable of being beached on any flat shore, capable of being carried short distances overland. These ships had both oars and a sail, a large square sail of linen or wool that could be raised when the wind was favorable, allowing the crew to rest their arms and let the wind do the work. When the wind failed, or when speed and precision were needed, the oars came out. The crew of such a ship, Homer gives us various numbers in different passages, might number 50 men or so for a standard warship. These men were not slaves rowing in chains, as would become common in later periods. They were free men, warriors who also rowed, soldiers who also sailed. The distinction between sailor and soldier barely existed in this world. Tonight we are going to follow one such ship. It is morning. The sun is barely up. The ship has spent the night anchored in a sheltered bay on a small island in the central Aegean, one of dozens of unnamed islands that dot this sea like stepping stones. The crew is beginning to wake, and far to the east, beyond the horizon they cannot yet see, the great city of Troy is waiting. The first light came the way it always came in the Aegean, suddenly, gloriously, as if someone had simply decided that the darkness was finished. One moment the sea was black and the stars were sharp overhead. Then the eastern horizon softened to gray, then to rose, then to a burning gold, and the water around the anchored ship shifted from darkness to a deep, rich blue that had no equivalent in the world of the pale north. Homer called it the wine-dark sea, and in the early morning light you could understand why. The ship was anchored perhaps 30 meters from shore, its stern rope tied to a boulder on the beach. It moved very gently in the small swell, a slow, rhythmic rocking that had lulled the crew to sleep, and that now, as the light changed, began to ease them back into consciousness. Let us pause here for a moment before the day begins, and simply look at the ship. It was perhaps 25 meters in length, a long, narrow hull built from timber. Pine and fir were the favored woods, sealed against the water with a thick coating of pitch and tar that gave the hull its dark appearance. Homer's black ships were black because of this pitch coating, not because of any paint or dye. The smell of it, resinous, sharp, slightly sweet, mingled with the salt of the sea into something that every sailor of this era would have recognized instantly as the smell of a ship. The hull curved up at both ends, the bow and the stern, in a graceful sweep, with a carved prow at the front. We cannot say with certainty exactly what these prows looked like, but later Greek tradition and some artistic representations suggest animal heads were common. Perhaps a boar, perhaps simply a painted eye, the eye that the ship needed to see its way across the water. Along each side ran the oar ports, the holes through which the oars were run when the crew was rowing. There were perhaps 25 oars to a side, 50 oarsmen in total. The oars were long and heavy, made of ash, balanced carefully so that a man could row for extended periods without exhausting himself entirely. At the center of the ship stood the mast, a single pine mast that could be raised or lowered, slotting into a heavy wooden block at the ship's keel. When raised, it supported the great square sail. When lowered, it lay along the length of the ship on a wooden crutch, out of the way. The crew slept where they sat, on the rowing benches, wrapped in cloaks, or curled in the narrow spaces between benches on the floor of the hull. There was no below deck. There was no cabin. The sky was the ceiling of this bedroom, and the stars that had wheeled above them through the night were just now fading in the growing light. Now the first man stirred. He was the ship's helmsman, the most experienced sailor aboard, responsible for the great steering oar at the stern that controlled the ship's direction. He was older than most of the crew, perhaps 40, his skin the color of old wood from decades of sun and sea air. He had sailed this sea since he was a boy. He knew its moods and its currents and its hidden rocks the way a farmer knows his fields. He sat up slowly, looked at the sky, looked at the sea, looked at the direction of the wind by watching the surface of the water and feeling it on his face. He was satisfied with what he saw. Good wind, coming from the northwest as it had been for 3 days. They would make good progress today. He began, quietly and without ceremony, to wake the crew. Before the day truly begins, let us spend a moment with these men. Who were they? This is one of the places where we must be careful and honest. Homer gives us a world of heroes, of Achilles and Ajax and Odysseus, men of extraordinary skill and semi-divine lineage, men whose individual deeds fill thousands of lines of verse. But the men who actually rowed the ships, who hauled the ropes and baled the bilge water and cooked the meals over small fires on the beach, these men are mostly invisible in the literary record. We can infer some things from the archaeology and from what Homer does tell us. The men on this ship came from different places. Bronze Age Greece was a world of small kingdoms and regional identities, and a fleet assembled for a great expedition, as the fleet at Troy was said to have been, would have drawn men from across the Aegean world. Some might be from the mainland, from the great palace kingdoms of Mycenae or Pylos or Tiryns. Some might be islanders, from Rhodes or Crete or the islands of the central Aegean. Some might even be from the coast of Anatolia, what is now Turkey, where Greek-speaking settlements existed alongside other cultures. They were not professional soldiers in the modern sense. There were no standing armies in Bronze Age Greece. These men were farmers, fishermen, craftspeople who had been called, or who had volunteered, for this expedition. They brought their own weapons where they had them. They served under the command of their local king or chieftain, who in turn served under the broader command of the expedition's leadership. The reasons they were going to Troy were as varied as the men themselves. Some believed genuinely in the cause. The recovery of the stolen Queen Helen was, in this world, a real and serious grievance, an insult to the honor of kings that could not go unanswered. Honor was not an abstract concept in this world, it was the foundation of social order. An insult unavenged was a wound that festered. Some came for the plunder. Troy was said to be fabulously wealthy, a trading city that controlled the approaches to the Black Sea and grew rich on the commerce that passed through. A successful sack of Troy would mean bronze and gold and silver, livestock, cloth, slaves, wealth enough to transform a man's prospects entirely. Some came because they had no real choice. Their king was going, and their king's judgment was law, and some, probably more than the poets recorded, were simply afraid, and were going anyway, because courage in this world did not mean the absence of fear. It meant doing what needed to be done in spite of it. Let us follow 3 of them through this day. The first is the helmsman we have already met. We will call him by a name common in the period, something like Theron. He is the oldest man on the ship, the most experienced, the one the others look to when the weather turns uncertain. The second is a young oarsman of perhaps 18, a farmer's son from the Peloponnese for whom this is his first voyage. We will call him Alexios. Though this name is somewhat later in origin, it carries the right spirit for our purposes. He has never been further from home than the next valley. He is terrified and excited in roughly equal measure, and he tries very hard not to let either show. The third is the ship's captain. We will call him Doros, a man of perhaps 35, a minor nobleman from a coastal community, not famous, not a great hero in the Homeric sense, but competent and respected, a man who has commanded men before and who understands the weight of that responsibility. 3 men, 1 ship, and the long blue road to Troy. The first order of the morning was food. This was not negotiable. You cannot row a warship for hours on an empty stomach, and the Bronze Age sailor understood this with the pragmatic clarity of someone whose body was his primary tool. The previous evening, before the light failed, several of the crew had gone ashore to prepare the evening meal, and the remnants of that meal, carefully stored, would serve as the morning's breakfast. Let us talk for a moment about what these men ate, because it tells us a great deal about who they were and how they lived. The foundation of the Bronze Age Greek diet was grain, primarily barley, which was hardier and more reliable than wheat in the thin, rocky soils of the Aegean. Barley was eaten as porridge, as flatbread baked on hot stones, as a kind of dried, coarsely ground meal called alfita that could be mixed with water or wine or olive oil into a quick, calorie-dense paste that a man could eat with his hands while rowing. This last preparation, simple, portable, requiring no cooking, was probably the staple of the ship's daily diet at sea. We know this partly from Homer, who mentions it specifically, and partly from the archaeology of Bronze Age provisioning. The great storage magazines of the palace at Pylos contained enormous quantities of grain, carefully recorded in the linear B tablets, some of it specifically allocated for seafaring expeditions. Alongside the barley paste or flatbread, there would be olives and olive oil. The olive tree was already ancient in this world. It had been cultivated in the Aegean for thousands of years, and olive oil was at once a food, a fuel for lamps, a medicine, a cosmetic, and a ritual substance. The sailors carried it in clay jars sealed with cloth. They ate the olives themselves, salted and preserved, and they mixed the oil into the barley to make it more palatable. There would be dried fish, salted and dried on shore before the expedition left, compact and preservable, a reliable source of protein. The Aegean was extraordinarily rich in fish, and fishing was both a food source and a way of passing time when the ship was at anchor. Fresh fish, caught in the evening and grilled over a small shore fire, was one of the genuine pleasures of this life. There might be wine, a small amount, heavily diluted with water. The mixing of wine and water was a fixed cultural practice in the ancient Greek world, and its roots go back to this period. Undiluted wine was considered barbaric, the drink of people who did not know how to civilize their appetites. A careful mixture, 1 part wine to 3 or 4 parts water, produced a drink that was mildly pleasant, safer than unpurified water, and socially appropriate. And there would be cheese, hard, salty, long-lasting cheese, made from sheep or goat's milk, which kept well in the Mediterranean climate and provided fat and protein in a compact form. This was the diet of the Homeric hero, not feasts of roasted oxen. Those were for special occasions, for religious sacrifices and celebrations. The daily reality was barley and olives and dried fish and diluted wine, simple, nutritious, portable, and adequate. On this particular morning, Alexios, our young oarsman, sat on his rowing bench and ate his portion of barley flatbread, with olive oil drizzled over it from a small clay flask. He ate slowly, looking at the water. The bay was perfectly calm. The island rose steeply behind the beach, covered in low, scrubby vegetation, wild thyme and sage and rock rose, their scent drifting out across the water in the morning warmth. A pair of seabirds, terns probably, were fishing about 50 meters away, diving and rising with mechanical precision. He thought about home. His father's farm was 3 days' walk from the coast. He had grown up smelling goats and grain and the particular dusty smell of a Greek summer afternoon. He had never been on a ship before this expedition. The first time he had stepped onto this vessel, rocking gently even in the sheltered harbor, he had gripped the side so hard his knuckles went white and had prayed silently to Poseidon, god of the sea, not to drown him before he even left the harbor. He was still praying to Poseidon most mornings, but more quietly now, with a little more dignity. The helmsman Theron moved past him, checking the oar ports, testing the ropes with practiced hands, looking at the state of the sail where it was bundled on its yard. He paused beside Alexios for a moment. "Wind is good," he said. "We'll make the next island before noon." Alexios nodded. He was not sure which island was next, or how far it was, or what would happen when they got there. The geography of this expedition was largely a mystery to him. He followed where the ship went, and trusted that the people who knew where they were going were indeed going there. Theron moved on. He had 6 ships' worth of concerns in his head at any given moment, and Alexios's anxiety was not among the most pressing of them. The signal to depart came from the captain, Doros, who stood at the stern and gave the order in a carrying voice that cut through the morning sounds of men moving and equipment being stowed. "Oars out." The crew moved with the efficiency of men who had done this many times over the past weeks of the voyage. Each man took his position on his bench, ran his oar through its port, and waited. The anchor stone, a heavy perforated rock tied to a rope, was hauled up from the seabed. The stern rope was cast off from the shore boulder by the last man to board, who waded through the shallows and swung himself over the side with an ease that suggested practice. The ship drifted free of the shore. "Ready," called Doros. And then the helmsman, Theron, set the stroke, a slow, steady rhythm, calling it out in a low voice, and the oars dipped together into the blue water, and the ship began to move. This moment, the moment a ship begins to move under oar, has a particular quality that is difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it. The resistance of the water giving way, the gradual gathering of momentum, the sound of the oars, the dip and pull and feather, a sound like breath, rhythmic and hypnotic. The crew rowed in silence mostly. The rhythm was everything. A man who rowed out of time disrupted the whole ship, his oar clashing against his neighbor's, the stroke losing its efficiency. The experienced men set the rhythm, and the newer men found it and locked into it, and after a few minutes the ship was moving at a good pace across the calm morning water. The island slid past on their left, the dark green of its scrubby hillside, a flash of white rock, a small goat standing on an improbable ledge, watching them pass with the impassive expression goats reserve for things that do not concern them. Then open water. The Aegean in the early morning has a quality of absolute peace that is almost sacred. The light comes in low from the east, turning the water into hammered gold near the horizon, and deepening to that extraordinary blue further out. The air is still warm from yesterday, and not yet hot from today. The sea smell is clean and sharp. Alexios rode and felt, despite everything, a sudden, uncomplicated happiness. He was 18 years old. He was on a ship crossing the wine-dark sea toward Troy. Whatever happened next, and he tried not to think too specifically about what happened next, this moment was real and extraordinary and his. He rowed. The ship flew. Let us stay with the rowing for a while, because it deserves more attention than it usually gets. The image most people carry of ancient galley rowing is grim. Slaves chained to benches, driven by a drumbeat and the threat of a whip. This image comes primarily from later periods, from the Roman and Byzantine eras when slave-powered galleys were indeed used extensively. In the Bronze Age Greek world, the picture was very different. These men were free. They were warriors who rowed. The same man who bent to his oar in the morning would pick up his spear in the afternoon if the situation demanded it. Rowing was not a punishment or a degradation. It was a skill, and a demanding one, and the men who did it well were respected for it. The physical demands were real and significant. Rowing a heavy wooden ship through even calm water for several hours was exhausting work. The muscles of the back, the shoulders, the arms, the legs, all were engaged. A man who had been rowing for 3 hours and was then expected to fight needed a level of physical conditioning that we might find impressive even today. The Bronze Age Greek body was shaped by this kind of work from a young age. Boys in coastal communities learned to row early, just as boys in farming communities learned to plow. By the time a man joined an expedition like this one, his body had usually been shaped by years of physical labor into something genuinely formidable. There were strategies for managing the exhaustion. The oars were rotated. Not all 50 men rowed at all times. The ship could be moved with fewer oarsmen when the conditions were easy, allowing others to rest. Men spelled each other in rotation, so that no one was rowing continuously for hours on end without a break. When the wind was good, the sail went up, and the crew could ship their oars entirely and rest. This was the great luxury of the voyage, a fair wind that did the work for you, filling the great linen sail and driving the ship forward, while the crew sat in the sun and talked and ate and slept. Theron, the helmsman, was a master of reading the wind and knowing when to raise the sail and when to keep it furled. He understood that a crew that arrived at the next island exhausted was a crew that would be slow to fight and slow to work, and that preserving the men's strength was as important as making good time. He also understood that the sea did not care about his plans. The Aegean could change quickly. A morning of glassy calm could become an afternoon of white-capped waves driven by a katabatic wind off the mountains. The helmsman's greatest skill was anticipation, reading the signs that the wind was about to shift, reading the color of the water and the shape of the clouds, and making decisions in time to avoid being caught in bad conditions with a ship full of tired men. On this particular morning, the wind from the northwest was steady and kind. About an hour after leaving the bay, Doros gave the order to ship oars and raise the sail. The mast was stepped, lifted into its block with a collective heave, steadied with the forestay and backstays, the yard raised, the sail unfurled. It filled with a sound like a sharp breath, billowing out to the northwest wind, and the ship surged forward. The crew relaxed. Men reached for food, for water, for the small personal items they kept stowed under their benches. Conversation started. The particular social texture of a ship's crew, its hierarchies and friendships and running arguments, began to express itself. What did Bronze Age sailors talk about? We cannot know, of course, in any specific sense. No one recorded the conversations on a ship crossing the Aegean 3,000 years ago, but we can make reasonable inferences from what we know of the culture, from what Homer preserves, from the universal concerns of men in similar situations across history. They talked about home. This was almost certainly the most common subject. The farms left behind, the wives and children and parents, the animals and fields and neighbors, the particular quality of light on a certain hillside at a certain time of year, the taste of water from a specific spring, the small, precise details of a life that is present to you most strongly when you are far from it. Alexios talked about home more than he would have liked to admit. In the evenings especially, when the light changed and the first stars appeared, something in him reached back across the water toward the Peloponnese with an almost physical ache. He thought about his mother grinding grain in the morning. He thought about the smell of his father's farm after rain. He thought about a girl in the village whose name he tried, with mixed success, not to think about. They talked about Troy. This was unavoidable. Troy was the destination, the reason, the gravity around which everything else orbited. What would it be like? How long would it take? The stories said 10 years, but surely that was an exaggeration. Surely it could not really take 10 years to reduce one city. Some of the older men said nothing when this topic came up. Theron, when pressed, would say only that Troy was real, and the war was real, and that any man who went thinking it would be easy and quick was a man who would learn otherwise. He said this without drama or prophecy, simply as a fact. The younger men did not entirely believe him. They talked about the gods. Religion in the Bronze Age Greek world was not a Sunday affair, a weekly ritual conducted in a special building and then set aside. It was continuous and immediate and woven into every aspect of daily life. The gods were real, not as abstract principles or distant cosmic forces, but as active, interested, sometimes capricious presences whose will shaped events. Poseidon controlled the sea, and his goodwill was not guaranteed. Before departure from any harbor, offerings were made. At sea, prayers were said at significant moments. When the wind changed, when islands were sighted, when the weather threatened. These prayers were not entirely different from the professional prudence of a modern sailor checking the weather forecast. They were a way of acknowledging the forces that lay outside human control. Zeus watched over the expedition as a whole. Athena guided the clever men, the strategists. Apollo could send plague or lift it. The gods were not decoration, they were infrastructure. They talked about women. We will leave the details of this to the imagination, as it was almost certainly less interesting than the tellers believed. And they talked, in the evenings especially, in the way that men far from home and facing uncertain futures always talk, about what they would do when they came back, the farms they would improve, the houses they would build, the marriages they would make, or the children they would have. The particular human habit of constructing an imagined future as a bulwark against present uncertainty. Doros, the captain, listened to these conversations without contributing much to them. He carried his responsibilities quietly, the welfare of 50 men, the condition of the ship, the progress of the voyage, the expectations of the kings above him and the men below. He ate what the men ate, slept where they slept, asked nothing of them that he would not do himself. He was not a hero in the Homeric sense. He would not appear in any poem. But the expedition could not have functioned without men like him, and some part of him knew this, and found a quiet satisfaction in it. We should pause somewhere in the middle of this bright morning to attend to the sea itself. Because the sea was not merely the medium through which the ship moved, it was a living world, a presence, something that the men on this ship were acutely and continuously aware of in a way that is difficult for a modern person, accustomed to air travel, to sealed vehicles, to the mediation of technology between body and environment, to fully appreciate. The Bronze Age sailor was in direct contact with the sea at all times. He could reach over the side and touch it. He could feel the ship's motion transmitting itself through the hull and the bench into his body. The long, slow roll of open water, the shorter chop of a cross sea, the sudden lurch when a larger wave came through. His body learned to read the ship's motion the way a horseman learns to read a horse, unconsciously, continuously, with the whole body rather than just the eyes. The color of the water told him things. The deep blue of open water was safe. The lightening to turquoise or green meant shoaling water, sand, or rock beneath the surface, danger, or at least caution. The dark patches that seemed to move under the surface might be a submarine reef, or might be a school of fish. You looked more carefully, and your experience told you which. The surface of the water told him about the wind, the way it cat's-pawed in the distance when a gust was coming, the direction of the small waves, the presence of a current running against the wind that made the sea choppier than it should be. The smell of the water changed too. Open ocean had one smell. The approach to land brought other smells, the vegetal richness of a harbor, the particular scent of particular islands that experienced sailors knew. The island of time was named for what it smelled like from a mile offshore. The sea was also always full of life. Dolphins were common in the Aegean, and their appearance alongside a ship was taken as a good omen. They seemed to enjoy the company of ships, riding the bow wave, leaping alongside, disappearing and reappearing. The crew of this ship had seen dolphins 3 times in the past week. Each time the mood on board lifted perceptibly. Even Theron allowed himself a small smile. Flying fish broke the surface and glided on stiff wings, silver in the sun. Schools of smaller fish could be seen moving beneath the surface, turning together in great coordinated sweeps that caught the light. Occasionally, further out, the unmistakable fin of a larger creature, a shark perhaps, or a sunfish, broke the surface for a moment and was gone. At night, the sea had its own lights, the bioluminescence that certain waters of the Aegean produce, particularly in warmer months, so that the ship's bow wave glowed a cold blue-green in the darkness, and the oars left trails of light in the water. The crew had a name for this. Some of them believed it was fire from the sea god's forge. Some believed it was the spirits of drowned sailors. Theron believed it was simply something the sea did in summer for reasons of its own. He had found, over a long life on the water, that the sea had many reasons of its own. Around midday, the island they were heading for came into view. This is how Bronze Age navigation worked, not by open ocean sailing, not by crossing hundreds of miles of featureless water, but by moving from island to island and headland to headland, always keeping land in sight or close enough to reach before nightfall. The Aegean's geography made this possible in a way that the open Atlantic, for example, did not. The helmsman Theron had made this passage many times. He knew this island, knew the bay on its eastern side where the water was sheltered and the holding ground good for anchors, knew the spring above the beach where fresh water could be obtained. This knowledge, accumulated over decades of voyaging, stored entirely in memory, passed from helmsman to helmsman through apprenticeship, was as valuable as any cargo the ship might carry. Navigation in this world had no charts, no compasses, no sextants, no written sailing directions. It had human memory, human observation, and the accumulated wisdom of generations of sailors encoded in practice and passed on through watching and doing. The stars at night, the color of the water, the direction of the swell, the smell of land, the behavior of birds. Certain species of seabird roosted on land, and their presence and direction of flight told you land was near. The shape of islands and headlands, recognized from previous voyages, each one as distinctive as a face. This knowledge was profound, and it was practical, and it was entirely oral. It lived in people, not in books or instruments. The ship rounded the southern tip of the island, and Theron brought them into the sheltered bay with the confidence of someone parking a familiar vehicle in a familiar space. The anchor stone went over the side. The sail came down. The oars came out briefly to bring the ship up to its anchorage, and then, for 2 or 3 hours in the heat of the midday sun, the voyage rested. This was the rhythm of the Aegean summer voyage. Hard sailing in the cool of the morning and the early evening, rest in the brutal heat of midday when the sun made open water sailing uncomfortable and the wind sometimes died away entirely in the afternoon lull. The crew went ashore in small groups. Some went immediately to the spring above the beach to refill the water jars. Fresh water was the single most critical resource for a ship's crew, more important than food, more important than any other provision. A ship that ran out of fresh water in open water was in serious trouble. The water jars were large clay amphorae, sealed with cloth and pitch to prevent contamination, and they needed regular refilling at reliable sources. Some men bathed in the sea, swimming in the clear shallows, washing off the salt and sweat of the morning's rowing. The Greeks were comfortable in the water in a way that many ancient cultures were not. Swimming was a common skill, learned young, practiced often. Some simply lay on the beach and slept. Alexios waded ashore and walked up the beach and found a flat rock in the shade of a single stunted olive tree and sat there for a long time, doing nothing in particular. The island was uninhabited, or at least, if anyone lived here, they had not appeared. The only sounds were the sea, the wind in the low vegetation, and somewhere unseen, a cicada conducting its endless one-note concert. He thought about Troy. He had been trying not to, but in the midday stillness, with nothing else requiring his attention, the thoughts came anyway. What would it actually be like? He had grown up with the stories. Everyone had. The great heroes, the gleaming walls, the 10 years of siege. But stories and reality had a way of diverging, as he was already learning. The sea he had imagined from inland was different from the sea he was actually rowing across. The men on the ship were different from the heroes of the stories. Perhaps Troy would be different too. He hoped so. He hoped it would be simpler and quicker than the story suggested. He suspected, in the way that young people sometimes suspect things they cannot quite articulate, that it would not be. While the crew rested, Doros walked. This was his habit at midday stops, to walk the shoreline, to think, to hold the shape of his responsibilities in his mind, without the constant interruptions of 50 men requiring decisions. His concerns were multiple and layered, and they formed a kind of permanent background hum beneath every other thought. The ship's condition was the most immediate. A wooden ship in continuous use deteriorated constantly. The pitch caulking between the planks needed attention. There were several places where he had noticed the ship making water slightly faster than it should, and at the next major harbor stop, he would need to arrange for the ship to be hauled out and recaulked. The oars were holding, but two were developing cracks that would eventually fail under load. The sail was good. The rigging was good. The crew's health was the next concern. 50 men in close quarters was a disease vector of significant potential. On the voyage so far they had been lucky. A few minor injuries from shipboard accidents. One man who had suffered a fever for 3 days before recovering. But plague moved through armies and fleets with devastating speed, as Homer himself recorded in the opening of the Iliad. Doros could not prevent disease, but he could ensure the crew had adequate water and food and rest, and he could make sure sick men were identified early and kept from infecting others. Then there were the provisions. The barley stores were holding adequately, but they would need resupply before the final leg of the voyage. He had a mental list of which islands along their route had reliable supplies available for trade, and which harbor towns had the kind of markets where bronze could be exchanged for grain. And then there were the men themselves, their morale, their conflicts, their individual difficulties. 50 men thrown together for weeks of hard physical labor and uncertainty developed their own social dynamics, their own alliances and tensions. A captain who did not pay attention to these things found them crystallizing into problems at the worst possible moments. There was a simmering disagreement between two of the crew, men from different communities who had brought an existing dispute aboard with them. So far it had expressed itself only in pointed silences and the strategic arrangement of sleeping positions, but Doros could feel it waiting to become something more. He would need to address it, probably this evening, before it became an infection in the ship's social body. He walked and thought and made his plans. This is the part of leadership that the heroic tradition obscures, the unglamorous administrative work of keeping a complex human enterprise functioning. Achilles in his tent, sulking over an insult to his honor, is a far more dramatic story than Doris on a beach, worrying about pitch caulking and grain supplies. But without the Dorises, the expedition could not have crossed the Aegean at all. He reached the end of the beach and stood looking out to sea. To the east, somewhere beyond the shimmer of the afternoon horizon, was Troy. He allowed himself a moment, just a moment, to think about what it would actually mean to get there. The chaos of a fleet landing on a hostile shore, the noise, the confusion, the fear. The years of it, if the stories were right. He was not afraid, exactly. He was something more specific than afraid. He was carefully, deliberately realistic, and realistic was sometimes harder to maintain than afraid. He turned and walked back toward the ship. There was work to do. The afternoon sailing began in the late afternoon, when the sun had moved west and the worst of the midday heat had passed. The wind, which had died away in the midday lull, came back from the northwest as it often did in the late afternoon. The daily rhythm of Aegean winds in summer, driven by the differential heating of land and sea. Theron had expected it and had not been surprised. The sail went up again. The ship moved. The afternoon Aegean was different from the morning. The light was warmer, the shadows longer. The islands they passed taking on a golden quality that the bleached midday sun had burned away. The sea was a deeper blue now, almost purple in the distant places where the light came in at an angle. This was the hour when the voyage felt most like the stories. Alexios, resting on his bench with the sail doing the work, looked at the passing islands and felt something shift in him, a loosening of the anxiety that had been his constant companion since departure, a replacement of it with something that was almost wonder. The world was very large. He had not fully understood this before. It was possible to travel for weeks and still be surrounded by beauty, new islands, new coastlines, the same sea showing a different face with every changing light. He was not sure this made him feel better about what was coming, but it made him feel, for the first time, that whatever came, he would have seen this sea, this light, this world. It was something. The islands they passed through in the afternoon were inhabited. Here and there, small settlements were visible on the hillsides or clustered around natural harbors. Fishing boats were sometimes seen, their crews pausing in their work to watch the warship pass. The warship did not stop, did not threaten. It was large enough to be respected and purposeful enough to suggest it was going somewhere specific and had no interest in small fishing communities. Sometimes the people on shore waved. This detail feels surprising. The casualness of it, the ordinary human gesture made across 3,000 years. But people are people, and a ship passing through your waters is an event worth pausing for, and a wave costs nothing. Theron always waved back. He had learned in a long life that the goodwill of coastal people was worth having. You never knew when you would need to beach on an unknown shore in bad weather and require help from whoever lived nearby. The memory of a friendly ship was a small investment with a potentially significant return. Let us pause in this golden afternoon and look more carefully at the material world these men inhabited. Because the Bronze Age Greek world had a particular physical texture that is worth understanding, not as an abstraction, but as the lived reality of these men's everyday experience. The name of the age tells us the most important thing immediately: bronze. The metals of this world were copper and tin, combined into the alloy we call bronze, and this alloy was the technological foundation of everything. Bronze tools, bronze weapons, bronze fittings for ships and buildings and furniture. Bronze was to the late 2nd millennium BC what steel is to our own age, the material that made complex civilization possible. The Bronze Age Mediterranean was, in consequence, an intensely interconnected world driven by the necessity of bronze. Copper came primarily from Cyprus. So important was this island as a copper source that its name gave us the word copper itself. Tin was rarer still. It came from far to the west, perhaps from the Iberian Peninsula, perhaps from as far as Britain. To make bronze, these two metals had to meet, which meant the trade networks of the Bronze Age had to span almost the entire known world. This trade was not incidental or peripheral. It was the engine of civilization. The great palace kingdoms of Mycenaean Greece were nodes in this network, receiving raw materials from across the Mediterranean, processing them, redistributing the finished goods. The linear B tablets record this activity in exhaustive detail. So many ingots of copper received, so many finished bronze tools distributed, so many units of grain in exchange for so many units of oil. The men on this ship wore bronze where they had it. Their weapons, swords, spearheads, arrowheads, were bronze. The fittings of the ship, the hooks and pins and rings that held the rigging and the gear in place, were bronze. When they cooked, if they had metal cooking vessels at all, those vessels were bronze. Their clothing was wool and linen. The linear B tablets record the textile industry of the Mycenaean palaces in extraordinary detail. Thousands of women workers processing wool into thread and thread into cloth. The finished cloth distributed in great quantities to palace dependents and traded internationally. The wool was dyed with natural dyes, the rich purple that came from sea snails, a substance so valuable that it would eventually give its name to an entire social class, and simpler colors from plants, producing blues and yellows and reds. The men on this ship were not dressed in the gleaming armor of heroic imagination. That armor was reserved for moments of battle. It was heavy and hot and impractical for daily life aboard ship. For the voyage they wore simple woolen tunics, belted at the waist, with cloaks for warmth at night. Their feet were sandaled or bare. Their hair was long. The evidence of artistic representation suggests long hair was common for Bronze Age Greek men, and their faces were likely bearded. They were physically not so very different from any other group of working men in the ancient Mediterranean world. Their distinction was cultural and situational. They were Greek speakers, followers of the Olympian gods, members of a civilization that had produced the palace at Mycenae, and the poetry of Homer and the habits of mind that would eventually, centuries later, flower into classical Greek culture. But they did not know that last part. They were simply themselves, men on a ship, going to war. The evening harbor was the reward for the day's sailing, as the sun moved toward the western horizon and the light turned to gold and the shadows of the islands stretched long across the water. Theron began looking for that night's anchorage. He had a destination in mind, a harbor he knew on a larger island ahead, and the timing was working out well. They rounded a headland, a great rocky promontory that dropped sheer into the water. And there it was, a bay, perhaps a quarter-mile across, sheltered on three sides, with a small settlement visible on the hillside above. Other ships were already anchored there, part of the same great fleet making its way east toward Troy, coming from different ports and taking slightly different routes, converging periodically at known stopping places, like tributaries joining a river. Doros recognized the captain of the nearest ship, a man he had sailed with before, whose crew were from a coastal community 2 days' walk from his own. They called to each other across the water. The ritual of the harbor, who was already there, how long they were staying, what news they had of the route ahead, began. The ship was brought to anchor in the familiar sequence. The sail furled, the mast lowered, the oars run out for the final approach. The anchor stone dropped, the stern rope carried to shore by the first swimmer over the side. The crew went ashore. And on the beach that evening, as the sun went down and the first stars appeared over the dark bulk of the island's hills, perhaps 100 men from 3 or 4 different ships gathered around fires and cooked and ate and talked. This was one of the things the stories did not prepare you for, Alexios thought. The ordinariness of it. 100 men sitting around fires on a beach, eating flatbread and dried fish, arguing about the fastest route, and telling stories about people back home. It was not so very different from any gathering of men around fires that had ever occurred in the history of the world. The heroes of the stories, Achilles, Ajax, Odysseus, were somewhere ahead, already at Troy or making their way there by different roads. But here, on this small beach, on this small island, the expedition was just this: men eating, men talking. The smell of wood smoke and the sea. It was enough. The evening meal was the day's main social occasion. Fresh food when possible, fish caught in the late afternoon from the ship or from the shore, grilled on sticks over the beach fire, flatbread baked on hot stones, olives, cheese, the small ceramic cups of diluted wine that marked the meal as civilized, as different from mere animal feeding. Before eating, an offering was made. This was not optional, not a formality, not the equivalent of saying grace without thinking about it. It was a genuine act of acknowledgement, a small portion of food and wine poured or placed aside for the gods, for the sea, for the wind, for the favorable journey so far, and the continued goodwill of the divine forces that governed these things. The Bronze Age Greek world was one in which the boundary between divine and human was porous and immediate. The gods were not distant, they could be present, in the wind, in a sudden change of fortune, in the dream that gave a man useful information, in the bird that flew in a significant direction. Recognizing their presence, acknowledging it with the appropriate gesture, was simply good sense. Doros made the offering for the ship's crew, a portion of wine poured out on the sand, a small piece of bread. He spoke the words quietly and without theatricality. He was not performing. He was communicating. Then they ate. The conversations of the evening were different from the mornings. The day's physical work had been done. The anxiety of navigation and wind and sea was set aside for a few hours. Men who had been focused and alert all day could let their attention relax. Stories emerged. Homer's world was, above all else, a world of stories. The oral tradition that would eventually produce the Iliad and the Odyssey was alive and functioning in this period, not as a literary tradition, not as written texts, but as the living practice of storytelling that preserved the community's history and values, and entertained it through the long evenings. There were men in this gathering who were skilled storytellers, not professional bards, but men with a gift for narrative, who knew how to hold an audience, how to pace a story, when to speed up and when to linger. They told stories of previous voyages, of heroic ancestors, of the gods themselves. The story told on this particular evening, and we are inventing this, to be honest, in the spirit of the informed dream we announced at the beginning, was about Odysseus. Not the story of the Odyssey, which had not yet happened, and which would not be told for centuries, but a story about Odysseus in his youth, his cleverness, his quick thinking, a situation in which his wit had gotten him out of trouble that his strength alone could not have resolved. The point of the story was the same as all Odysseus stories, that cleverness was a kind of heroism, that intelligence was as valuable as physical courage, that a man who could think his way out of a problem was as worthy of honor as a man who could fight his way out. The crew of this ship listened. Some smiled. The young men stored the lesson away, not consciously, but in the way that stories are stored, somewhere beneath the level of active thought available when needed. The fire burned down. The stars were fully out now, brilliant and thick in the darkness above the island, their reflections moving in the black water of the bay. The night came down gently, as Mediterranean nights do in summer, not the dramatic, rapid darkness of northern latitudes, but a slow, gradual deepening that moved through the colors of evening in its own unhurried time. The fires burned low. Men moved from the beach back to the ship in ones and twos, or found flat patches of sand above the tide line and lay down with their cloaks wrapped around them. Some slept on shore. Some slept on the ship. The division was informal and based largely on who wanted the slight motion of the anchored hull to rock them to sleep, and who preferred the solid stillness of the earth. Alexios chose the ship. He had found over the past weeks that he slept better on the water than on the beach. There was something about the movement, the slow, rhythmic rocking of the hull in its anchorage, the small sounds of water against wood, the creaking of the rigging, that had become associated in his body with safety and rest in a way he had not expected. He arranged his cloak on his bench, tucked his sandals under his head as a pillow, and looked up at the sky. The Milky Way was extraordinary. The ancients did not have a name for it as a galaxy. That understanding was millennia away, but they could see it clearly, in a way that most people living in modern illuminated cities cannot. A great river of light across the sky made of stars too numerous and too faint to resolve individually, glowing with a soft, continuous light. He lay and looked at it for a long time. The ship moved. The water spoke softly against the hull. Somewhere across the bay, one of the other ship's watch was singing. A low, repetitive melody, the kind of song that has no real beginning or end, the kind that exists to fill silence and mark time. He thought about tomorrow. Tomorrow they would sail again. More islands, more blue water. The pattern of the voyage was familiar now. The morning departure, the hours of sailing, the midday rest, the afternoon sailing, the evening harbor. He had learned to live inside this rhythm, to let it carry him rather than resisting it. And beyond the tomorrows he could see, the ones that were still just sailing and islands and stars, was the one he could not quite imagine, the shore below Troy, the sound of what would come. He tried not to think about that one. He let the ship rock him, he let the water speak, and slowly, gradually, with the stars wheeling overhead in their ancient courses, he slept. Not everyone slept. The ship required a watch through the night, someone awake and alert, monitoring the anchorage, watching for changes in the weather, ensuring the anchor held and the ship did not drift toward the rocks in a shift of wind. Tonight the watch fell to Theron. He did not mind. He had stood more watches than he could count over the decades. He had spent more nights awake on ships than he had in beds. He sat at the stern, his cloak around his shoulders, and watched the night. The bay was quiet. The other ships were dark shapes in the darkness, their riding lights, small oil lamps hung at the bow, flickering gently. The settlement on the hillside above was entirely dark, its inhabitants long since asleep. The moon had risen, not yet full, but bright enough to silver the water of the bay and cast a pale light over the anchored ships. By the moon's position, Theron judged that it was perhaps 3 hours after midnight. Another 2 hours until the sky began to lighten. He was not sleepy. He had learned long ago to enter a particular state on night watch. Not fully alert, not asleep, but somewhere in between, his body resting while some deeper part of him remained monitoring. He would know instantly if the wind changed. He would hear any sound that did not belong. This was not a skill that could be taught directly. It came from time. He thought about the voyage. They were making good progress, better than he had expected. The winds had been unusually cooperative. The crew was holding together well, better than some crews he had sailed with. Doros was a good captain, which helped. A bad captain could poison a crew's atmosphere within days. He thought about Troy. He had been there before, not in this war, which was new, but in a previous voyage, years ago, when he had been part of a trading expedition that had put in at the harbor below the city's walls. He had seen the walls from the water. They were real and they were impressive, and they would not be easy. He did not say this too often. The young men did not need his realism. They needed their courage, and courage and realism were not always comfortable companions. But he held it himself, this knowledge. The thing ahead was real and hard and uncertain. He had seen enough of the world to know that the stories always simplified. Life on the sea had taught him this above everything else, that the sea did not simplify. It gave you exactly what was actually there. No more, no less. The night moved. The stars completed their slow arc. A fish broke the surface somewhere in the darkness of the bay. A single splash, then silence. Theron pulled his cloak tighter and watched the eastern horizon. Somewhere out there, in the place where the darkness was not yet quite as absolute as elsewhere, the faintest difference was beginning to make itself felt. Not light exactly, not yet, just the suggestion of light, the memory of light, the promise that light would come again. It always had. He had been watching for it his whole life, and it had never failed him yet. He watched, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the darkness began to soften. You have felt the rocking of the hull and heard the creak of the rigging, and watched the stars wheel overhead from a bench on an anchored ship in a sheltered Aegean Bay. You have sailed the wine-dark sea. It is enough to carry with you into sleep. The ship is still. The stars are out. The water speaks softly against the hull. Somewhere ahead, beyond the horizon, the dawn is gathering. But not yet. For now there is only the rocking of the ship, the breathing of sleeping men, the helmsman watching the stars, the sea. Sleep well.